Hi, ladies. So, we're going to be experimenting today in a new way that I can deliver you the lecture with your notes. So, today we are going to be talking about Japanese American internment, which you know some things about because of reading Looking Like the Enemy. So, we're a little bit ahead. We don't have a ton of notes to go over. But I want to start out with talking about Executive Order 9066, which this was what started the whole process. It was signed by FDR, so it is an executive order that comes from the desk of the president. And basically, this is authorizing the Secretary of War to establish those military zones on the West Coast. So that, like we read in Mary's book, made it possible for them to order anyone of Japanese descent. And that included people like Mary, who are American citizens, from those military zones. And the reasoning behind that was a military necessity out of the fear that the Japanese would potentially sabotage, what our war effort here, and of course, the fear of them attacking the West Coast. So when we talk about the term interred, that just means internment camps are confined in a relocation camp that is very remote. So they're far from the coast of where they were living before. Everyone of Japanese ancestry, both citizens and non-citizens, again, that included people like Mary and her parents. There were about 110,000 in total. So when we look at everyone that lived in those military zones, that's about the number that they had. Nisei, we're kind of familiar with that word. That means people like Mary and Yanichi who were born here. They were citizens, and they're born to Japanese immigrant parents who are known as the Issei. We've seen this in Mary's book, but this was the posters that were sent or hung, I should say, in these military zones with instructions of what this means for those of Japanese ancestry and the evacuation orders. It was a very fast relocation. So, you think about like life, think about what we're going through right now with closing schools. And, a week ago we were in school and now a week later we're not. And how many businesses have had to close and decisions that have been made in the past, even last 48 hours that have such an impact on just regular life. So, I think we can relate to Mary and her family in some ways of not really knowing what's going to happen. So think about, those feelings that she had and her family had. And as we read in her book, they didn't have a ton of time to really kind of process everything that was going on. And unfortunately, because of this fast relocation and the fact that they didn't have any communication while they're in these camps, many of them will lose their businesses, will lose their homes, will lose their farms. I'm not going to give away any of the endings to the story, but we'll find out what happens to Mary's family and their family farm. But, they had no idea where they were going. They didn't know, just like as Mary experienced, did not know where they were going to end up. And so it's very scary. I think that's probably the most frightening thing that one can experience is the unknown. You just don't know what could potentially happen or where you were going. So when they get to these camps, as we saw that Mary's experienced, most of them are in really desolate places, not very great living conditions. Families live in these barracks that are basically just wooden bunk beds thrown together. A lot of times things had to be shared among families. A lot of anti-Japanese sentiment going on in the West Coast. So you would see signs like this. I know I showed a few of these before. This actually is a picture of a storefront where it was a Japanese American owner. This is before the evacuation, and stating that I am an American, and almost feeling the need to have to somehow justify, themselves in this situation. So a really terrible situation, scary for everybody, but yet terrible for Japanese Americans and this situation. This is another map. We saw a map in Mary's book, but this is just another version of that map. So you can see in the pink area, and this, how I'm recording this lecture, I'm not able to actually highlight anything. Oops, I gotta go back. Okay. So the over here on the coast, you'll see that that's kind of a pink area on the Pacific, in the Pacific Ocean, that's the military zone. So that is up to the north in Washington. You see the inner lakes that, it's not the ocean, but the inner lakes, the blue part, that's actually where Mary lived. And so from that far north all the way through Southern California and into Arizona. So you see some of that area on the map. In the squares are the majority of the internment camps. Now, the map in Mary's book shows you the assembly centers, and that's the first place that her family was sent. That doesn't have that on this map, but so there were actually more places designed for this whole process than are showing on this map. This is a picture of a family from California who were packed to go to their evacuation point. And this photo was taken by Dorothea Lange, who I mentioned her when we were studying the Great Depression, and she is a famous photographer. And many of her pictures through the Great Depression, and then she goes on to document the Japanese American internment. Really, I mean, this is just one of many pictures, but just to document that what was happening and what these people were going through. This is another one of her photographs of families getting on the train. This is almost exactly out of Mary's story when she describes what it was like to go to the train, to get on the train, and you've got all these soldiers that are lined up, a lot of them, saying really nasty things to these people, and it was not, a nice experience whatsoever. So Dorothea Lange has, again, hundreds of photos that she documented, and mostly were kind of filed away for many years. And these photos will come out later on once Japanese internment is talked about a little bit more. This is an aerial view of the camp. Some of the, I don't know exactly which one off the top of my head this one was, but this is just to kind of give you a visual of what we're talking about. These are the barracks. And again, most of these places originally were for livestock, for horse races, if it's a horse racing ground, but these are built for animals, not human beings. So one of the things that Mary and other people faced were the weather conditions, because some of these places were, in the middle of the desert where it'd be really hot. They could be up in the mountains where it was cold and snowy. I know one of the places that Mary and her family were living had a lot of, it was really windy, and they had issues with that. So these were not standard houses or hotels or anything that had insulation. On closer inspection, to give you just an idea of what they were like, this is it's like animal stalls. And so because this was such a fast process and things were sort of just slapped up together, you can kind of see maybe they threw doors on, or they put down the wood planks so they could get from one area to another. Very poor, shoddy construction. So let's talk about what we would say would be a landmark Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States, and this was in 1944. This is the I don't want to say the first because there were many, but this was the one that the Supreme Court heard over um, legal issues involving violation of someone's civil liberties. So Korematsu was a man out of California who refused to. He was an American citizen, and he refused to be evacuated. He was arrested, and he actually did some jail time, and he became a convicted felon because he refused the relocation policy. He was one of the very few, if any, of the Japanese Americans that actually did like speak up and refuse to go. So he sues the United States in violation of his civil rights, and the Supreme Court in the end ruled in favor of the United States, saying that this wasn't about race, that it was based on military urgency. And it really sets a bad precedent because it's basically saying then, well, the government can, violate your civil rights and your civil liberties, because we're in wartime. And so this still stands, unfortunately. And of course, Americans come to see and view internment as a great injustice. Korematsu, I think he lived until like the mid 1980s. He might have lived longer, but I can't remember off the top of my head what year he passed away. But his family, he continued to try to clear his name for the majority of his life, and his kids did as well. And finally, he was cleared of, being a convicted felon. It's a difficult life. It's difficult to get employment. You have that kind of mar on your background. And so he will end up being cleared and his record expunged, which means it's erased. And, unfortunately, though, he lived most of his life with carrying that. In 1988, which is about 45 years after this whole thing happened, Congress passes what's called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and Congress awards any surviving Japanese American basically $20,000 each, which really, and an apology. In the grand scheme of things, first of all, this is 45 years later, so you're looking at maybe somebody even like Mary, who's almost like 70. It's not something that like you can just kind of write off and say, oh yeah, sorry about that we, yes, we're apologizing and it's an official apology, but it is what it is. So at least the government acknowledged what happened was wrong, and acknowledge the fact that this could have been, handled in a different way, in which it did. And, the lesson behind Japanese internment is the fact that we live in a democratic society that guarantees us rights in those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And we have a right to liberty and a right to freedom. And, there are times like what we're going through right now where it calls for us to be and to give something back and to, make these sacrifices. Like doing online school right now is somewhat of a sacrifice. Now it's not a huge one, but, it makes us do a little bit more work. But in the end result, hopefully we're saving lives. In this case, it's much different. And so you have to really think about some of the things that, these people go through. Now, this is nothing like the Holocaust, which is what you're going to read and learn about next. But in some ways, there are a few similarities, mostly differences. And the United States did not murder or kill any Japanese American citizens, but the consequences of them being interred were definitely deaths and casualties, not in high numbers, but people who got very sick that weren't very well cared for, living in these conditions that were somewhat in squalor, So, there is some humanitarian issues definitely with everything that had happened. Okay, so that is the end of this part of your notes for Japanese American internment. Um, Again, as always, please, under the class comments, let me know if you have any questions. I am always available, ladies, to FaceTime, and we can figure out a time that best works for you if you want to go over anything or you want to discuss something with me personally. Please let me know. Thanks. We'll see you next time.